which helps us to live that faith in all that we do. You have blessed us with minds, bodies, and souls, and spirits, and we thank you for all of that. And especially today, we thank you for our minds as we try to study once more the Apostle Paul, one of those great apostles who was all about spreading your Son's word. Lord, as we learn, help us understand that the end is not to learn. It's not to become experts on Paul or Paul's letters or even any other thing that's just an academic endeavor. We're all about faith. Help what we learn deepen our faith, deepen our commitment to be your disciples in all that we say and all that we do. And as Paul saw that your Son, Jesus, was the most important thing in his life, may we see that as well in our lives as we pray through that your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, as I said, welcome. So good to see so many here today. Does anybody wasn't here last week? Okay. I had some outlines up here. I hope that you found that from last week. If anyone else wants one, let me know and I'll bring some more copies. That's what I'm going to do each week is I'm just going to keep the outlines. As I said last week, as we go through this, you really do not need to be at every one to understand what's going on. So I kind of likened it. We're not a CBS one-hour drama where if you miss 1 week and you show up the next week, everyone's lives have changed and you know people are paired with different people than they were before and you don't know why that is. For the most part, that's not going to happen. I mean, we are going to be, in a sense, building because today we're going to talk about how we can study Paul, and we're going to look at 7 different ways that we can do it. We're going to be using those 7 methods as we go on. But if you weren't here today, you would probably still be able to pick up on what it is that we're talking about. So it isn't the end of the world. Now, also today, if you have a Bible with you, we're going to be doing some examination of some verses in Paul. We'll be doing more as time goes on. We're not going to do as much today. If you don't have it, again, it's not the end of the world. We'll convert you and make you a true Lutheran, and so that you will have it in the future. But also, we have some extras up here in a basket if you do want to follow along with it. But as I said, we're not going to do as much this week. As time goes on, we'll be doing more of it. So, as I said, today we're continuing the background on Paul. Next week, no class. Okay, we're taking next week off because we're taking Tuesday night off for Pastor Ronnie's installation. So since we're taking the Tuesday night off, we're going to take the Wednesday off as well. Because I've already met people where a married couple, one person comes on Tuesday night, the other comes on Wednesday morning, and then they talk about it. I've had a few people talk to me about that, and I think that's really kind of neat that they do that. So we want to try to keep it on the same. So next week, no class. So we'll be talking about Paul the week after that, and that will be our 3rd session on Paul. And then in the month of November, it switches back to Pastor Dean, who's going to be talking about the Gospel of Matthew. So that will go on for the month of November. Then in December, we're going to continue our background. Okay, so you have to have patience. Why don't you put some back on that table for me, Ken? Thank you. We're going to continue our background on Paul in December. Now we're going to do the first 3 Tuesdays in December. I wanted to do the 4th Tuesday in December, but that's Christmas Day. But we really don't do much here on Christmas Day, right? Christmas Eve, that's when we do it all. So I'm free on Christmas Day, but you might have other things to do on Christmas Day. And I think I'll be tired because, see, we have a 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. So, Christmas Day, maybe I'll sleep in and we'll just not have to worry about it. So we'll have 3 sessions in December, again, background on Paul. And then after the start of the new year, we're going to be looking at the books, or the letters, I should say, of Paul. We're going to look, so then you'll definitely want to have your Bible. And as I said last week, what my hope is, unless Pastor Ronnie changes his mind, we'll be spending 2 weeks on a particular book, one from an academic perspective, which is what I'll be leading, and then one on a more Bible study or a more spiritual perspective that Pastor Ronnie will be leading. So I'm kind of excited about that, and that's kind of what I'd like to see. It's kind of an expansion of what Hope University does. We want to be able to challenge our mind, body, and soul, and throughout the entire university. And so that's what we're trying to do. Okay, let's see if there's any other announcement kinds of things. Any questions before we get into our topic here today? Okay, well, let's go ahead and go. I think I did have the books here last week. I didn't have them on Tuesday night, but our main book that I'm using is this book right here, Paul, Apostle to the Nations and Introductions by Walter F. Taylor. This is my main source, and I'm using this source as kind of the outline of what we're doing each week because I like the way he did it. I read several books and looked at several sources, but I like the way he kind of split up the background. And so what we're doing between now and Christmas is kind of his structure. But then this is the other main source that I'm using, N.T. Wright. And this actually is, this is a more commercial kind of book. If you've ever read anything by N.T. Wright, he's a very interesting person. If you're a novel reader, you like reading novels. When I exercise, I listen usually to James Patterson or something like that because I just want something completely worthless, I guess, or just, mindless, I guess I should say. This isn't mindless, but it's written in a novel kind of style. So he talks about Paul almost like it could be a character in a novel. So I recommend any of N.T. Wright's writings. All right. Now, at the end of the class, we're going to have some study questions. And last week I said the teacher in me knows that when you're teaching students, you don't pop up at the end what the goals of the class were. You always set learning goals at the beginning so that when the test time comes, they're not surprised by the things that are going to be on the test. So in a sense, our test, we don't have a test. Remember I said last week, everybody gets an A in here. Okay, that's really good. That's what outrageous grace looks like. So everybody gets an A, and we're all about grace, right? But at the end, we're going to have some questions that I'd love to have your input on. We had some really interesting comments made on the questions last night. So I think this group is just as interesting, if not more interesting, than the people we had last night. So I would hope that we have the same thing. Oh, by the way, the other thing I wanted to say is, remember what's different this year in Hope University is this is being live streamed. So everybody wave at the camera. They're all watching us now. And it will also be available on the Hope website for 2 or 3 months. So if you do miss it, then you can go back and actually watch it. So that is something that's new. All right, so question number 1. As I said, we're going to look at 7 methods that you can use to study, in our case, Paul's letters. These 7 methods could be used to study the Gospels. They could be used to study, the Pentateuch. We could look at the first 5 books of the Old Testament. We could look at any kind of, or we could even look at something not biblical, and we could still have some of these things. So as we go through these, just kind of keep track in your own mind of which ones seem to resonate with you. Secondly, on the other end of the spectrum, which seems to have the most difficulties for you? And the reason why it's going to be good to identify that now is because we're going to be using these methods as we progress through the letters. Okay, that's where we're going to bear the fruit that we're now. I think I used the example last week of like coat hooks. We're building our hooks now so that you'll have something to hang your coat on when we actually look at the letters. And so as we go through these hooks, kind of listen to your heart. What is it that's resonating with something that makes sense to you? We had some people last night who they liked something because it was completely different than the way they were raised. That may be something you like because it's completely different. On the other hand, which seems to have the most difficulties? Question number 3 is kind of related to question number 1. If there's a method you really like, is there something that you would like to know more about? And I actually can give you a bibliography on each of these 7. I have a breakdown of other sources if you're interested in that. And then, again, you don't get a higher grade if you do that. You still get the A. Okay, so, and then number 4, what are some reasons for using a combination of methods rather than using only one? So this is kind of my learning goals as a teacher. Instead of doing a learning goal saying this is what you're going to learn, I want to show you the questions ahead of time so that you kind of know as we're going through this what it is you should kind of be putting in your mind, okay? All right, so how can we study Paul? This is our topic today. how can we study Paul? And you're going to notice that each of these sessions is a question. Last week our topic was, why study Paul? Today's question is, how can we study Paul? This says 30 years ago there were two methods to use. One was history and the other was theology. If we back up to before 30 years ago, then what does that mean? What was there? Well, typically, theology probably, but we have to remember that we're willing to come and take a look at the letters of Paul from an academic standpoint. There are vast numbers of people, especially Christians of certain denominations or certain persuasions, who don't want to study them. They just believe that the Bible is the divine Word of God. It is inspired. They take it literally, and so anything that we're doing at all, and I talked to someone last night who was in class who that was the way they were raised. And so even they said just the fact that we want to study it at all is a challenge. So we have to realize there's a lot of people who feel that way. And so if that's in our mind, maybe we need to challenge ourselves. But we're trying to study it to try to understand it better. And as I told this person last night, as I have learned more, it's actually deepened faith, not challenged it. Sometimes when we challenge our mindset, it actually ends up deepening our faith. But 30 years ago, as far as we're going to look at 7 today, there really were only 2, and we're going to cover these 2 and another 5. So it says in the 21st century, for us, we have several others in addition to these 2. And what I want to say about those 2, and even the other ones after that, is that it makes it more complicated. In a way, those who want, and again, there are whole congregations that don't want it to be complicated. Let us just read it and believe it the way it's written. And that's not complicated. But even though we're going to complicate things a little bit, and we're going to see maybe that sometimes it's hard to know exactly what's going on, or there might be contradictory messages going on, in the long run, it makes things more productive. And ultimately, as I said in my prayer, this is all about our faith. This is all about our spirituality and deepening that spirituality. All right, so let's start with historical study. If you are a historian, historical scholar, then what you're doing is, and I'm not talking just about the Bible here, I'm just talking about historian in general. You're interested in a systematic study of the past. Now, the key word here is that word systematic. You're not just looking at a hodgepodge. You're trying to see what kind of a system or how it can fit together. And typically, you're working with other historians who have other expertise, and you work together, 2 or more or 3, however many you have, who can come up with a systematic understanding of what was going on in the past. Now, if you're a historical scholar, you can only use the parts of the past that are accessible. Okay, there's lots of things we'd love to know. Wouldn't you love to read a biography of Jesus' life? Okay, and some read the Gospels and think that's a biography of Jesus' life. Well, if it's a biography, it wasn't a very good biographer because there's lots of missing time. I mean, a good biography would let us know more about their childhood and what they did when they were a teenager. And so as far as historical study, if it's not accessible to you, then you're either going to have to make a decision to say we can't make any conclusion, or you're going to have to speculate. For example, was Paul ever married? We don't know. Do we know there was a time when he wasn't married? Well, of course, there's a time when we're all not married, right? Even if we are married. Let's look at 1 Corinthians. Okay, so 1 Corinthians, everyone knows where that's located. We're going to do chapter 7. All right, so 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Now, I'm using the NIV, okay? And as I look around, I see various translations, which is good. I'm sort of counting on that because one of the issues we're always going to have is different translations. And we have to talk about that sometimes because the way that things are worded could mean completely different things in one translation than they do in another. Mine gives a little title here. It says, this is concerning married life. Now we're going to skip a few verses because these cause problems for some people, okay? So we're going to skip verses 1 through 6. We're going to start with verse 7. In verse 7, my translation says, this is Paul speaking, of course, to the church in Corinth, I wish that all of you were as I am. Okay? I wish all of you were as I am. That's going to be clearer here in a minute what he means by that. But each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. On to verse 8. Now to the unmarried and widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion. There you go. Now we know why we have to marry. All right. Now, again, so we're talking about a danger. If you just pulled that out and said, this is our teaching, that's not a very holistic view of marriage, is it? So there's danger about just pulling something out. But is Paul married at this time? No, he says very clearly there, I wish that they were as I am, unmarried. Now, remember, I said this last week, Paul thinks that the end is, it's knocking on the door. Okay, because as a Pharisee, he believes in the resurrection of the dead, and Jesus has been raised from the dead, and so since resurrection has started, that means the end must be coming. So basically, if you're going to take on a wife right now, you're really taking on more than you need to. Just stay the way you are. Unless you can't control your passions, then go ahead and do it. That'll be good for a while. But so at this point, it is clear that Paul is not married. There's speculation, and we'll talk about this later on when we start talking about whether Paul was married. But there's speculation that he would have been married at one time, but his wife died, and that now he's unmarried. He was a Pharisee. And so there is some speculation that as a Pharisee, he would have been married. Okay, I liken this to, there are some people, when I was in seminary at St. Meinrad, I took a January term and I went to the Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville. And I remember vividly there were students who were in their 4th year who were desperately looking for spouses because that made them more marketable. Okay, and they were basically, I'll marry anybody. Are you willing to marry me? Then I will marry you. Because that looked better on their job resume. That's kind of the way the Pharisees were. The Pharisees really looked at marriage as being something that completed the person. And we'll see later on that there's a lot of evidence that Paul was a Pharisee. For one thing, he says he was a Pharisee. So when we look later on at what a Pharisee believed and what they thought, marriage would have been one of those things. So it would have been kind of difficult to think that he would have been a Pharisee. Remember, before he met Jesus on that road to Damascus, he was a good, solid, faithful Pharisee. And to be that way and to be recognized that way without being married would have been unusual. That's all we can say. But see the last 4 words there? But no historical evidence. So anyone who comes to you and tells you for a fact that Paul was married or was not married, they are making it up. They're speculating. There is no historical evidence. Now, I want to sort of focus in. I was a math teacher, so I used to use Venn diagrams. You remember Venn diagrams, circles? And sometimes you have a circle and you have another circle, and they overlap or they don't overlap. Well, if we looked at historical study as being a circle, inside that circle there would be another circle called biblical historical study. Okay? Now, it's inside, which means it has all of the elements of historical study, but historical study doesn't necessarily have all the elements of biblical study. It's like I used to tell my students, a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square because squares are a little circle inside the rectangle. But we're not doing math, so we won't worry about that. Now, if you're doing biblical historical study, and you're focusing on the Bible, and for us, we're focusing on the letters of Paul, it is mandatory that you're able to study the text in its original language, which would have been Greek. Now, I mentioned last week that Paul probably also knew Hebrew, and the Old Testament, remember, we're not calling it the Old Testament. We're calling it either the Hebrew Scriptures, which we're probably not going to do that because Paul probably didn't use the Hebrew Scriptures. We're going to call it Israel's Bible. So that's one of the things we talked about last week is terminology. So if we look at the Israel's Bible, it would have typically been in Hebrew, but Paul was probably using a Greek version because Greek would have been his language. That's the language he wrote his letters in. So what we're going to do is, all 7 topics we're going to look at today, we're going to use one example. And we're going to look at it from the perspective of those 7 different methods. And that is going to be the background of the word servant. So I'd like everybody to open their Bibles to Romans 1, verse 1. Which way do you go? Forward or back from? You go back. So Romans is before Corinthians, right after Acts. Romans is the first letter after Acts. Okay, my translation says this in verse 1. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. Anybody have a different word? Anybody have a word other than servant? Everybody's Bible says servant? What are your
Messenger.
Messenger, interesting. What else? Slave. Anybody else's Bible say slave? Okay, now look and see if there's a little number or a letter by that word servant. And does it have a reference down in the bottom saying, this one doesn't. The NIV does not have anything there. Greek slave. Okay, so even, I like to use this example because it shows in one example of one little word, the difficulty in taking a translation and running with it. Unless your Bible is in Greek and you understand it in Greek, which most people don't, we're all using a translation that has taken every single word from the Greek and has turned it into another word. So when I see the word servant, this is what I think of. Is this what Paul had in mind when he called himself a servant? Was he coming with the tray with wine to serve those with a little towel over his arm? So the word that is used here is the Greek word doulos. And the Greek word doulos is actually a slave. Okay, now that word is packed with a lot of connotation, right? When we read the word slave, we think things a lot differently than we do if we think of servant. And I preached on this summer when I was looking at Philippians, which begins the same way. And actually, Gracia based it on something that John said, where he was talking about the number of letters that Paul introduces himself as a slave. Okay, now what I love about Romans, notice that instead of introducing himself as a slave or an apostle, he does both here. Okay, and that's kind of unusual because in most letters he either introduces himself as a slave or an apostle. But for our purposes right here, we're seeing the difficulty of seeing a Greek word and translating it one way versus another. Now, messenger, that's probably the least emotionally packed word of anything, right? A messenger sounds like, yeah, do you have a comment?
No, I just made a mistake on that. Messengers in the next one.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's too bad. I was hoping messenger was in there. Man, that's too bad. Romans chapter 1, verse 1. So the very, very first line of the letter to the Romans. Well, that's too bad. I was hoping messenger was in there. But you can see that if you use the word slave, again, to modern ears, that has all kinds of connotations that are negative. Servant's kind of taking the edge off a little bit. And after all, servant is good, right? We are called to serve. Jesus calls us to serve. So we use the word serve anyway in a context of being ministers. So most people would read this as servant and not think anything of it. That sounds good. Okay, I'm a servant of Jesus. But there is something important, because if we look at the true translation, then we have something that's a lot more packed. All right, let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say about this. Oh, the other thing, the text also makes it clear that who's the master? Jesus Christ, and we're going to talk about that in a couple minutes too. Yeah, Mary?
Well, the little statement next to
And this
that
is in the Lutheran
explains-
Study Bible, right?
Yeah, that says being a slave is a good thing, in a way. I mean, they were proud to be slaves of Caesar, and they were proud to be slaves of Jesus. That term, at that context.
Okay. And we're going to look at that too. What did it mean to be a slave of Jesus versus being a slave of Caesar? We're going to see that. That's one of our methods that we're going to look at. Okay. All right. Any other comments on that? Okay. Oh, by the way, one of the things I did want to say about biblical historical study, they don't only look at the Bible. They look at other historical sources as well, but their primary source that they use is the Bible. Okay, so it's not like that they're going to not look at other things. All right, limits. There's two limits that I want to talk about up here. The first one is that historical study of the Bible claims scientific objectivity for its observations and conclusions, in the same way a laboratory chemist would claim to have objectivity. And there are some people that think, well, it's kind of hard to have that same kind of objectivity. You know, it's kind of like me as the math teacher. It's easy for me to see objective. 2 plus 2 is 4. We can't say it's almost 4. We can't, give partial credit because you had 3 or 5. At least you were in the right ballpark. No, 2 plus 2 is 4. That's objective. But, we live in an age right now where what's objective is very questionable, because even things that we grew up with thinking were objective, for example, the news. We grew up thinking it was objective, right? If Walter Cronkite spoke, it was objective, and we knew it was objective. Now we look at it, we read it, and we read sentences that we say, that's not objective, and that's on the first page of the paper. So we live in an age where objectivity is really hard to see where there is objectivity. Well, those who think that they are objective, mathematicians, chemists, and so on, those in labs, would look at historical study and say, no, you're not objective in the same way that we are. And then secondly, the scholar can get so wrapped up in the wealth of historical data that it's easy to overlook the context. So for example, we just looked at the word slave. If you are a historical scholar and that is your focus, is that word, because you can have historical scholars who will focus either on a word or a character, and that's what they get to know. In a way, they kind of lose the forest for the trees. You ever heard that expression? So I jotted that down because to me, I think that that's sort of what this is saying. You get so involved in the tree that you're working on that you lose the forest. You can't see the forest because of the tree that you're looking at. However, ultimately, becoming so caught up in the interesting historical data gathered that one overwhelms the text with it, you can be absolutely outstanding in the historical work that you do and bring so much baggage to it that you're actually bringing more to it than was meant. So you can go a little bit overboard if you're a historical scholar by the things that you find. Okay, let's see if there's anything else. I will say that, because I don't think I have a slide on this. There were two scholars, Leander Keck and Victor Paul Furnish, who say that historical study of the Bible, quote, has been an astounding success, for repeatedly the biblical text has been understood more accurately than before. So even with these limitations, historical study has done a lot to help our understanding, not just of Paul, but any other biblical letter or book that we would look at. Number 2, political study. Now, I like this graphic because when you say political study, I know for me, if you say politics right now, I have a whole different, it brings up a lot of different images for me now than even 30 years ago. We become very politicized, right? And so good things come to mind when you say politics, but bad things. And I like these little bubbles here because some of them are good, some are bad. Corruption, okay, that one's not quite so good. But for us anyway, politics has become so packed with so many different meanings that it's kind of hard for us. And I'll talk about that here in a second. First of all, this is a subcategory of historical study. So this would be, if we had our circles again, inside the circle there would be a political circle. So it's still going to use historical methods, but it's looking at politics. I made a note here that this is tricky for us as 21st centuries because we have so many, we talked about slave a minute ago. I think politics is probably something even harder for us because it's so fresh. And, you know, especially for us in the last few years, politics has become a matter of Democrat versus Republican, conservative versus liberal. We have so many things that we pack into that for some people, politics has almost become a dirty word. Okay, whole groups. I mean, when I play golf with somebody, two things we can't talk about, religion and politics, otherwise we won't have a good round. Okay, so if you're into political study, you probably don't have much conversation when you go to parties. So on the one hand, we see politics everywhere. Some people read politics into everything that's said. You know, it gets said, and you know, either the Democrats or the Republicans, someone is behind this has influenced this, and they see it in everything, even if it's not meant to be. And that has permeated our society and our culture right now. But on the other hand, we also believe in the separation of church and state. You all remember that? Okay. It's kind of hard to see anymore because the lines have been blurred so much, but so we kind of have this schizophrenic personality when it comes to politics. You know, on the one hand, we think that it should be kept out. There's the place for state, there's the place for church. We have a history that's led to that belief. So we didn't just come up with that nilly-willy, but we knew what it was like to have the government mandate what was going to happen in church, and so we like to separate them. But what does that mean? And we could have a whole class on what that means, right? Does that mean that two should never even look at each other or talk to each other? Do they have a right to look at each other? Should they be looking at each other? It was the proponents of liberation theology. How many of you have heard of liberation theology? Liberation theology, which especially became very popular in the 70s. Liberation theology questioned the whole separation of church and state and said that if you find people who are being oppressed, okay, because of the power of some other people, then the church has a responsibility, not just a right, but a responsibility to address that. So that challenged this whole idea of separation of church and state. This is the environment we have grown up in when we think of politics. When we look back to Paul, there's also political systems going on then. And it's very difficult for us to sort of scrape away the way we look at politics and political study to be able to look accurately what would have been going on with Paul and his world in the first century. So if we look at the example of the servant versus a slave, there's a potential danger of reading modern political agendas into the ancient text. So from a political perspective, is Paul trying to say, excuse me, but I'm a slave of Jesus Christ. I am not a slave of the emperor. So Mary, this is kind of what you were talking about. Is Paul trying to make a political statement in saying that? Some of the rest of you, you're slaves of the emperor. I am not a slave of the emperor. I'm a slave of Jesus Christ. Was that what he was trying to say? Now, does that change what we said earlier with slave? That brings a whole different meaning to it, if indeed that's what he was intending to say. Does he say that in the text? Does he say, I'm a slave of Jesus Christ, not a slave of the emperor? Doesn't say anything at all about the emperor. But this is what a political study would look at. They would look at, is that what he's trying to say there? Number 3, this is going to be our longest one because there's 3 subcategories of this. The social sciences. This investigates the Bible, or in our case, we're looking at the letters of Paul using models and tools developed in the social sciences. And so I have kind of an umbrella there because this is a very broad concept. Social sciences, if we look at it, we think of psychology, sociology, and all of those other things as well. Okay? Now this, looks at the text as a product of its social and cultural world. So what we would be looking at, if this is the method of study we're using, is we would look back at the first century when Paul is writing, and it would try to look at the psychology of what's going on, how people are relating to each other. And so the text that we're reading, how is it reflecting that? That's what this one would look for. This is a relatively new approach to biblical text because it's a relatively new field. I mean, psychology as a recognized field has not been around a long time. I mean, it's been around for most of our lifetimes, but it's grown a whole lot as far as having some validity. As I said, we're going to be looking at three basic social scientific approaches in our study. Okay, social scientific study is going to be a big one because this is the one that's looking at the first century world from the perspective of what was going on day in and day out in people's lives. So the first of these would be social history. By social history, we're looking at, this is the work that describes and analyzes the social matrix of ancient literature, history, and archaeology. Someone mentioned archaeology last night. You know what a matrix is, right? So matrix is a bunch of things. A spreadsheet would be a matrix, you know, where we have lots of things that connect. So this is looking at how all of these things connect. So it doesn't look at just one thing in order to figure out what's going on in a society. It's going to look at the literature, the history. It could look at the artwork. I'm going to show that here in just a second here. The 19th and 20th centuries is when this century began to gain popularity. And if we use the example of slavery, this method would explore texts, artwork, inscriptions. Notice here the matrix, lots of different sources, not just one way of looking at it. What's going on? What are people writing about it? What are they drawing about it? What are they inscribing about it to see what a career of a slave would look like in antiquity? So here's a picture that came from this time that shows slaves at work. So we see just a general thing here of various things they're doing. We see a slave there handing a pot up to somebody. We see someone pushing something on the ground. And we see someone over there who's digging with a pickaxe. So this would be something that, if you're into social history, you would want to look at this. You would want to look at writing about it. You would want to look at inscriptions to try to come up with an idea of what it would mean to be a slave, day in and day out. What would your daily life look like? Okay, second, sociological study, or a sociological exegesis, which is just a fancy word for study. This is a more narrow look. So we talked about the other being a matrix, where you bring in all of these sources. This is a little more narrow look, specifically at a sociological context. So by context, we mean you would look at not only what's going on here, but instead of looking at all those other things, you would look at the context, what's going on in the life of this person. Again, to help build a picture, if we're looking at slaves, for example, what would the life look like at that time? So in the example of the slave, which modern sociological theories of power and leadership could help us understand how first century Romans heard Paul's self-identification as a slave? Now notice the word modern. In other words, instead of going out and looking at the matrix outside in the first century, it would look at this kind of up and down through the years. Okay? We're going to see that again in another method as well. But it's more focused. So, you'll notice that my picture now is focused in on one slave, just to indicate that we're looking at a much more focused perspective here. How do theories of social class help us in understanding this term? And then finally, cultural anthropology. This is looking at human culture, what's going on in the culture, all right, at that time. I found this little picture here, and this seemed to, I'm a picture person, this seemed to draw a picture to me of what I think we're trying to say in culture. If we think in culture, there are people who are sort of bonded together. There are other people who are not. Times we reach out to them. What is it in culture that does that? So this is going to be particularly interested in the values of a given culture. When you look at a given culture, what is it that they value? What is it that drives them each and every day? And if you don't think this changes from age to age, when I look at what a first century value system would look like, you would see that for the most part, our values are a little different today than what would have been so important to them. This studies how social groups are organized, what this means for social inequality, gender relations, and political authority. So social inequality, we would say the haves and the have-nots, right? So socially we have people that have it and people that don't have it. We might use all kinds of words when it comes, we might talk about economic things, for example, the nouveau riche or the old rich. We would talk about that. Some people might even bring in blue collar, white collar. There's lots of other things that we could use that would be sort of modern takes on social inequality. If we're looking at this time, what words would be used for social inequality? Gender relations, extremely important to understand. Because if you don't understand that, then reading Paul, you can make some really, really unfortunate decisions about what relationships should be between the genders. So it's important to understand what's going on with that. And then political authority. You see this kind of bleeds into our second method. Political authority, who has the power and what does that mean for the culture? So the value dyad I want to look at for this particular time is the concept of honor and shame. Because this would have been perhaps the most important value dyad to people at this time. Honor would have been extremely important. So you see I have both internal and external. Internal was the way you felt about yourself, that you yourself felt honorable. External was the honor that others gave you, the status that you had. So the internal is the value of a person in his or her own eyes, but added to that we have the person's value in the eyes of his or her social group. Honor was very important. You wanted to have honor. Do we want to have that? Well, of course we do, but is that like a supreme value that we see written in the newspaper? This is an honorable person? Not quite so much. Shame was loss of honor. And that's something to be avoided at all cost. You did not want shame. Now again, is that as important to us as it would have been back then? Well, for the most part, I don't think so. But if you think of someone who is an important family, say they're very politically connected, or they're social icons of a certain area, and something bad happens in the family, say one of their daughters gets pregnant or something like that happens, and so there's concern about loss of honor in that family. But most of us would say, those days are over. People don't feel like they used to. So I don't think that the whole idea of honor and shame is as important of a didactic as it would have been once upon a time. Yeah, Lanny?
I think a good example of that is some of the televangelists that lost their status.
Well, absolutely. And everybody remember Gary Hart? Yeah, right. He was on a boat with a young woman, and that was it. So I think that in a way it feels like we're coming back around to that again. But the honor-shame kind of importance of things, unless you're well-connected and really important, is not something that seems to drive us the way it would have in the first century. Yeah, Bonnie?
It also depends on the culture that you come from.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the United States, we have a lot of subgroups.
And we'll see that that's not unique to us when we start looking at the world that Paul lived in. I mean, if he just would have stayed in Tarsus, or maybe just stayed in Rome, but even Rome. But remember, he went through an entire empire. So we're going to be looking at all kinds of groups and subgroups that he would have been involved with. Okay? By the way, stop me anytime if you have a question or comment, because I really like that. Okay, so if we summarize the social scientific study, there's been a hesitancy on the part of some. This is going to sound familiar. We said this just a minute ago about the historical. to accept the validity due to the fears that it would overwhelm or ignore historical study. There are some, and I think that we're not there anymore, but there are some who look at psychology and things like it as being kind of a soft science. You know, it's like, it's a little too touchy-feely. It's not quite as objective. I think we've gotten a lot better about it, you know, but I can remember a time, I can remember my parents, you know, talking about psychiatry. Well, they call them doctor, but they're not a doctor like my doctor, you know, who, you know, they can tell what's wrong with me. Well, we know it's not quite that simple, even in a field like medicine. But we've come a long way. I think that we accept those things that were considered to be soft sciences as having something very valid to say. So I have, in our study of Paul, it's essential that we place our author and his documents in the reality of the first century world to help us understand the dynamics of the text themselves. This is the method that tries to understand the world of the first century. This is the method that's looking at what did a day in the life look like? You know, what kinds of interactions would they have had? What kind of people would they have been talking to? What would a day in the life look like? That's under social scientific study. Because we have to remember that Paul, as well as his first century readers, or his first readers, and by readers I also mean listeners, because these letters were probably read out loud to a group of people. So only one person would have been actually reading it, the rest would have been listening. They were part of a first century social system, both within this church and in the larger society. And remember what I said about church last week. We're not talking about church. I mean, some people, I think, well, it was a smaller church. Obviously, it wouldn't have been the size of Hope Lutheran Central Campus, but maybe more like Lake Weir. It wouldn't have even been that. Picture your living room and a few people coming over, and that's what we're talking about. Now, when we get to places like Corinth, it's bigger, but still, they're trying to find a place to be. There's no, here's the church, here's the steeple, open the doors and see God's people. We don't have that yet. It's going to take a while for that to happen. Number 4, rhetorical study. It's too bad Anita's not here because she helped me with both this one and the 5th one, because as an English teacher, rhetorical study is something really important in what it was she was trying to teach students. I have a little cartoon here. There's 2 women. She said, "Oh, I broke up with Tom. He kept pulling me into his rhetoric." So we use rhetoric, right? We use the word rhetoric. So let's talk a little bit about what it could mean. And we're going to read a couple things here.